Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Crown Lecture. Whether you're here in person or online, we're really pleased to have you with us. And I'm glad to introduce our special guest to you tonight, Cal Newport. This lecture is part of our Crown Lecture Series, and it's made possible through the generous support of the Crown family and Lester Crown in particular. And so it's a centerpiece of our Distinguished Lecture Series, and this one really focuses on ethics and norms and behaviors and things that we want to be mindful of. And so this is a nice fit with that, and we want to thank the Crown family. And also want to thank the members of the Sanford Board of Visitors, some of whom are able to be with us here tonight, for their support of the school. And I'll just go right into tonight, this important conversation that I'm going to I'm sorry. This important conversation, why can't I focus on emails, smartphones, and the age of distraction, featuring our special guest. And in that spirit, please silence your phones. Cal Newport is an associate professor of computer science at Georgetown University, and his scholarship focuses on the theory of distributed systems. I have no idea what that is, but hopefully we'll be a little wiser. And he also writes for a general audience, sort of exploring the intersections of culture and technology. And he's also the author of 7 books, which is, just one or two more than me. It's not, It's A World Without Email, A Digital Minimalism, and his most recent one, right? The most recent one is Deep Work. Other way around. There you have it. Deep Work, Digital Minimalism, and A World Without Email. And these titles include multiple New York Times bestsellers and have been published in 40 languages. He's also a contributing writer for The New Yorker. He wrote an interesting piece last spring about whether AI has a mind. And he's a host of a podcast called Deep Questions. So Cal is here today because we wanted to focus on this question of technology broadly, how it's affecting our lives, how we're interacting with it, in the context of a broader focus we have on the Sanford School on regulation and policies around technology and how that is affecting us, our lives as private citizens, etc. And so these are all areas that we're very focused on. And Cal will give some remarks about half an hour, 35 minutes or so. And then we're going to open it up for questions. And there's some mics right here. So as Cal starts to wind down, we invite you to then come up to the mics and we'll have a broader conversation before we wrap it up. So thank you, and Cal, welcome up here to the mic.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Dean Kelly. Thank you, the Crown family, for making this possible. Spent the afternoon meeting with students from all over the campus and faculty, and it really has been a treat. So it's been a good day for me so far. So this is what I want to talk about broadly is techno-distraction. But what I want to do with this topic is use techno-distraction as a case study to better understand some of the more general dynamics for how technology impacts us in our lives and what we might do about it. There's a lot of ways into this issue, so let me give a little bit more background on me so you understand exactly the angle at which I'm coming at these issues. So traditionally, as mentioned, there's 2 things I was associated with. So I am a computer science professor. I've been a computer scientist at Georgetown since 2011. I do theory, and actually, it's good news that you won't learn more about what I do before this talk is out, because that's a completely different type of lecture. I'm also someone who does a lot of public-facing writing. Last decade or so, this writing has been really focused on technology and the different ways that technology impact our lives. So these last 3 books, Deep Work, Digital Minimalism, and A World Without Email, they're all about that. And my role as a contributing writer for The New Yorker, also, this has been my beat. Technology and the interesting ways in which it interacts with our lives. More recently, these are coming together, and I think this is important for understanding how I'm going to approach today's topic. Georgetown has a focus now on digital ethics as a tier 1 concern. They really want to do good work on this topic, like they did on bioethics in the 20th century, where they were really a pioneer on that, and I've been involved in those efforts. So I'm one of the founding faculty members of the new Center for Digital Ethics at Georgetown. I'm the inaugural director of the new Computer Science, Ethics, and Society academic program. This is a major that undergrads can major in. And this combines both of these sides, and it's the approach I'm going to take to this topic today. So I'm not going to be purely, I'm not going to figure out how to use the slides because I'm a digital minimalist. It's true, I'm always worried, by the way, if I'm giving one of my technology lectures that the tech's getting so smart that it's just going to shut itself down and my mic's going to turn off and the lights will go. I think we're like 3 iterations of ChatGPT away from that. So I'm not going to be purely in the weeds technical, nor am I going to come at this purely pragmatic, oh, here's what you should do about your phone. We're going to come at this from somewhere in the middle. So trying to understand the dynamics of some of these technologies so that we can come up with some ideas about how to deal with them from a policy perspective, from an organizational perspective, and yes, perhaps from a personal perspective. But we want to merge these two together today. So if we're going to talk about techno-distraction, I think there's 2 charts that give us a snapshot of what we're facing right now. This chart over here, the blue chart, this is about distraction in work. This is showing email usage. This comes from data from a company called Rescue Time. Rescue Time sells software that you use on your computer to monitor your usage of different applications. It gives you reports. You know what you're really doing. Right around 2015, 2016, they figured, hey, we got a lot of data. We should actually analyze this. And so they hired a couple data scientists, and they anonymized it, and they began publishing reports. And this was one of their more blockbuster findings. This took data from 26,000 knowledge workers. And what they did is that for each knowledge worker, they took 1 day and said, for that knowledge worker, what was the average gap between checks of an email inbox or chat program like Slack? 26,000 knowledge workers, 1 average check duration, and then this is just a histogram of those durations. And as you can see, the median value here is 6 minutes. So half or more of this data set was checking their email inbox once every 6 minutes or more. The mode of this histogram is 1 minute. So essentially constantly checking their inbox, constantly checking Slack. All right, keep this in mind. This is a big deal. This is something that's taking up a lot of our time. This is something that is having a notable impact on our day-to-day experience. Over here, this chart is looking at our life outside of work. We're looking at smartphone checks more generally. This is data from Gallup. It's put into an infographic from Statista. They were asking respondents how often you check your smartphone. Until you get towards the older age demographic, it's strong majorities are checking them at least a few times an hour, with large percentages that are checking them every few minutes. This is self-report data, so it's a little bit optimistic on the standpoint. We know this from doing log analyses. If you actually look at phone logs, you get numbers that are roughly around 100 to 200 checks per day. That's a pretty safe range for what people are actually doing with their smartphones. So this is also an example of technology that is drastically changing something about our day-to-day experience. 10 years ago, we did not look down at our hand 150, 200 times a day. Today, we do. 25 years ago, we did not stop what we were doing and check an email inbox once every 6 minutes, but today we do. So these are important case studies of major technological change. Now, before we look too deep at how we got there, we should ask the obvious follow-up question, but are these bad changes? I mean, maybe this is all good, maybe this is all bad. What do we know about them? So we can check that out next. Let's think about the email case study first. Is this a problem that we're checking it this often? I'm going to argue that we have a lot of reasons to believe it is. We have a lot of data that's coming out of organizational psychology where they actually can study the connection between email use and subjective well-being. There's a whole literature on this, actually. People who go to offices and study what happens in the offices. And we have a strong correlation. Use email more, stress goes up, anxiety goes up, subjective well-being goes down. This is a quote from one of these papers. The more email they handled, the longer they worked, and the more time they spent doing email, the more overloaded they felt. Now we can ask, why is email, checking it as often as we do, why is this associated with stress? Well, there's 3 reasons I identified when I researched this for my last book, A World Without Email, which was all about the rise of email in the workplace and how we got there and what we should do about it. And there's really 3 things that seem to be going on. There's the overhead, and by overhead I mean the cognitive overhead. Something we forgot when we designed these new workplaces is that the human brain is relatively slow to shift the target of our attention from one direction to another. So-called network switching is a relatively expensive neurological process. We have to inhibit some semantic networks within our brains. We have to activate other networks. This takes a little while to do. So what happens then if you're checking an inbox once every 6 minutes? When you glance at that inbox to see what's going on in there, you initiate one of these expensive cognitive context shifts. But you don't give it time to complete because that could take 10 or 15 minutes. So it initiates, but then you rinse your attention back to the paper you were trying to write. So you arrest that context switch and try to switch back to the context of your paper. But 5 minutes later, you've gone back to the email inbox, and so you've initiated another context switch, back and forth. The brain never actually has a chance to settle onto one cognitive context where it can actually think clearly, and this exhausts us. And it causes burnout, and it can rise anxiety, and it's why by 2 or 3 p.m. the average knowledge worker has this sense of, I just don't really want to work anymore, and when they look at their inbox, they have to just leap around looking for the easy emails. The brain is exhausted. So that's part of what's going on here is overhead. Sociality also plays a somewhat insidious role here. Again, not intended by the designers of email, but there is a particularly stressful allure to an inbox that we're not looking at because we know it contains messages from people who need things from us. And even if we have corporate norms and our frontal cortex can tell us it's okay, they're not expecting a response right away. There's deeper parts of our brains that says the tribe needs us and we're ignoring them. This is a problem. You ignore the tribe, they don't share food during the next famine, and you have death and your genes aren't going to pass on. My God, we got to check the email inbox. We really do have this connection. So there's an amplified anxiety that comes from just the idea of emails piling up that has to do with a mismatch with the way we're wired and the way modern computers are wired. Finally, we have the ineffectiveness issue. It turns out that we are not very good at linguistic communication. Communicating to you with words is hard to do. And not only is it hard to do, but we think we're good at it and we're not, which makes it worse. There's studies on this, which are actually pretty entertaining, where they can measure the confidence of the person writing the email, that what they're saying is going to be understood versus how well it's actually understood. These are, they're not even. Because when you're writing the email, you have the entire emotional, psychological context in your head. You hear your voice in your head. Your joke makes a lot of sense. You're laughing at it. And the other person gets it and is thinking, oh my God, I guess Cal hates me. And I guess we're going to have to fight now or something, right? Because we're not very good at linguistic communication. So it's frustrating. We have frustrations. We have the anxious allure of sociality. And we have this real issue with cognitive overhead, the cognitive context shift overhead. So we have reasons to understand why email is a problem. Okay, so what about us looking at our phones all the time? Is this a problem as well? I think the appropriate canary in the coal mine to look at here is the generation of the young people who are in this room right now, college students in particular. They turn out to be a good canary in the coal mine because when we had the sudden uptick in smartphone adoption, which really was at its apotheosis of rate of uptake around 2012. That's when we hit the 50% penetration of the US market in smartphones. When the college generation came to colleges with smartphones, they went into the smartphone behavior all in, right? It was night and day. We didn't have them, now we do. Those of us who are a little bit older were a little bit more clunky in how we got used to phones, but younger people were quicker. And we have good data on young people. We can look, for example, at the American College Health Association assessment, the American College Health Association National College Health Assessment. This is a good, well-respected mental health survey because they have a lot of longitudinal data. They ask the same questions year after year. What do we see if we look at this? Right around 2012, this is the first year where we really saw college students bringing smartphones to campus at a large rate. anxiety-related depression goes up. Other types of common things you would see in a college mental health context stayed more or less stable. So it's not necessarily a self-reporting issue. There's actually a signal going on here. Now you can look at this data. It's complicated data. There's a lot of it. I've been reporting on this a little bit for the New Yorker. I actually have an hour-long talk that I wrote for my kids' school. They asked me to come give it. That goes only into the data on anxiety and smartphone use. And it's a complicated literature. And my 5-second summary of it is we now have increasing independent lines of research that are all coming towards the same conclusion that, yes, excessive smartphone use does have these negative mental health outcomes. So we're starting to get the signal. There's something not going right with us checking these phones all the time. Now, I looked into this in my book, Digital Minimalism. There are a lot of mechanisms being proposed for why is looking at our phone all the time making us less happy. They all have to do with stuff we lose. We lose in-person connection. This is called social snacking. That's what social psychologists call it. We say, I'm not going to bother going to see you in your dorm room or at your house because I can text you. I can WhatsApp you. I can comment on your social media posts. So we don't see people in person. The problem is the deep social centers of our brain expect very rich streams of input when we're interacting with someone. Their voice, how it changes, their body language, what's happening in the room. And so when we don't get that rich input because we're just looking at text on a screen, the deep social parts of our brain say, well, we're not socializing at all. And we start to get these paradoxical findings that started coming out around 2016 that was saying more social media use was making loneliness go up. It's because we were replacing the type of connection that our brain actually craves. We're also losing better activities. There's a lot of focus, I think, in critical social media and smartphone coverage on what we're doing on the phones. A big finding I found when I worked with 1,600 people for digital minimalism to walk them through a digital reimagining of their life, a big finding I found was that for most people, their issue was not what they were doing on the phone. In fact, it was quite boring what they were doing on the phone. It was what that was taking them away from. Their issue was, I'm spending less time doing this and more time doing this, and it's the missing this that's causing the trouble. We lose self-reflection in this as well. Time alone with our own thoughts, critical for human development and human flourishing, especially if you're young. Time alone with your own thoughts is how you process information you've encountered in the world. Time alone with your own thoughts is how you develop your identity as a person. If you have this thing that at every moment can give you highly salient, optimized distraction, why be bored? Why be alone with your own thoughts? You miss out on that self-reflection. Without that mooring, without that psychological ability to process the good and the bad, anxiety will also go up. So we're seeing all of these different mechanisms that could help explain why this shift towards constant phone use has some negatives. And of course, the final issue here is the thing we hear about most, is that we've lost the ability to be moderate. So in particular, social media-driven communication, this idea that we want everyone to be on the same small number of homogenized platforms, driven by incredibly heavy curation, makes it seem like the world is constantly on fire and everyone is our enemy. That also makes us anxious. So we have good causal mechanisms here to suggest why we're seeing these trends growing between mental health outcomes that are negative and increased uses of phones. All right, so this is now the key question. So what we just established is, yes, this is a good case study. We validated this as a case study for us to study. Email and phones. Coming almost out of nowhere, these technologies drastically changed elements of our life, and they brought with them negative externalities. This is exactly the type of thing, if you study technology from an ethics perspective or from a policy perspective, this is exactly the type of thing that you want to study and be wary of. Oh my God, a technology that comes along, changes a lot of things, introduces a lot of negative. So it is worth it to spend some time, and this is what I like to do in my work, to spend some time to try to understand the story of how did we end up in this place. Let's start with the email story. This is one I've spent a lot of time trying to pull apart. I think this story here, which I found originally mentioned offhand on a Quora thread, and then I tracked down this engineer who was involved with it and got more of the details from him. I think this story that I'm going to tell you, which comes from IBM in the 1980s, captures more than any ever I've heard how email ended up changing work. It's an important story. So here's what happened. 1980, I think it was 87, somewhere around here, IBM headquarters, Armonk, they say, we need email. We've seen professors have this. This looks useful. We can build our own email server because we're IBM. Let's have email. Because IBM is very careful, they said, okay, how much is this going to cost? Mini computers were expensive. And they said, we'll go find out. And so there's a team that included this engineer, Adrian Stone, who I talked to, who they sent them out to measure all of the communication that was happening in the Armonk headquarters of IBM. So the voicemails, the memos that goes back and forth, the notes, they were really into notes. They would, if you didn't find someone in their office, you would leave a note, and then they would come back to you, and they'd leave a note. They counted this all up. And they said, let's be really conservative. Let's say people really like email, and they move 100% of their communication to email. Let's provision a mini computer server big enough to handle that. So they provision this server, they turn it on, and it takes 3 days before the server melts down from overload. It was 5 times the communication they measured was happening within 3 days of turning on this server. So that was Adrian's quip. Thus, in a mere week or so, was gain and blown the potential productivity gain of email. They were so excited right before they turned on this switch. No more voicemail. This is going to be great. And then within 3 days, 5x communication, more than they'd ever seen before at IBM. The reason why this is so important is because 3 days is too short for there to be a lot of intention in this. There were no managerial meetings where they said, how do we want to use email? We should talk a lot more. There was no trainings. They said, here's our new communication tempo at IBM. There was no business book that came out. It was called the High Tempo Inbox Future, and they really got into it, and someone came and gave a talk. This happened essentially emergently, without coordination in ad hoc fashion. Almost literally overnight, the entire way that IBM was functioning in terms of their communication volumes just changed almost on its own. So what is actually going on here? The way they were working was more brittle or fragile or malleable than we might expect given the amount of time we think about managerial thinking. It was able to drastically reconfigure its phase, this phase shift of drastic proportions, with essentially a very little stimulus and no actual explicit coordination. Now, how is this type of thing possible? It's actually baked into knowledge work. So knowledge work as a concept can owe a lot of our current understanding of it to this one person, Peter Drucker, the very first management theorist. He coined the term knowledge work in the 1950s. He really helped midwife knowledge work as a concept throughout the 20th century. This is what it is. Here's why it's different than a factory. Here's how this is going to work. And the point that Drucker drilled in, I did a whole article about this where I went back through his archives. The point he really drilled in and had huge influence was saying autonomy, autonomy, autonomy. Knowledge workers are not assembly line workers. You can't give them a 6-step instruction. You gotta leave them alone to figure out how to do their work themselves. It demands that we impose the responsibility for their productivity on individual knowledge workers. Knowledge workers have to manage themselves. They have to have autonomy. He says this all the time. And of course, he was right about the fact that the actual work that new knowledge workers were doing was complicated and creative, and it couldn't be broken down to an assembly line. He was right that often new knowledge workers knew more about what they were doing than their managers, so it didn't make any sense that their managers could tell them how to do their work. But in this shift towards autonomy, we also added in to the individual worker's responsibility, how do you organize your work? How do you talk about your work? How do you triage what you should and shouldn't do? When is the communication about this work actually happen, and what systems do you use? That all got put on the user, the individual, as well. Managers gave you objectives, individuals figured out how to do their work. My contention is it is in this environment of autonomy in knowledge work that we were susceptible to these drastic reconfigurations about how work happens. Because it's up to each individual, we could see an emergent swarm behavior. If a new tool came in and everyone at that headquarters started making a different individual decision, you could overnight change the whole way the thing operated. Work was more fragile than we realized, and when email came in, it made a change. Now, how do we know that this particular tool could have such a difference? Well, there was an interesting case study I pulled up that I think personifies this. It comes from a study that Gloria Mark's team ran, where they went to this U.S. Army Natick soldier R&D Center. So it was basically a place where they did experiments and wrote reports about it, sort of a scientific knowledge workplace. And they came and did this study where they took a dozen workers and said, with no preparation, we're turning off your email for a week. And they watched them. It was a really interesting experimental design. If we want to understand the impact of email, why don't we take it away and see what happens? Interesting study. And it actually went well for the workers, and they were happier, and they were more productive, the stuff you might actually expect. But the point about this I want to make is something that's not in the paper itself, but something that Gloria told me about the paper when they were working on it. And she said, when I was working on this paper, there was one individual in particular who was really frustrated with his boss, because this particular individual had a job where he had to set up the lab for experiments on a regular basis, and it was complicated. And his boss would email him all these questions. What about this? What about that? And it really frustrated him because he was trying to set up the lab. And so this lab setter up individual, he was one of the 12 who they took email away from. And the interesting thing was, during that week without email, the boss stopped sending him all those little questions and tasks. And Gloria said this is why this is important, is because the boss's office was 3 doors down from the lab. So the gap in friction here between walking 3 doors down and expending a little bit of social capital to say, hey, can you answer this question, versus putting that in an email, led to a drastic change in the behavior of the boss and how many emails he sent and how much work he put on his plate. And Gloria pointed this out because it indicates how these little differences, we're already communicating in the office, but now we're taking the friction down. How these little differences can have a real change in our behavior. And you multiply this over 10,000 people making similar individual decisions, and I think this is how we ended up in a culture of doing much more communication, much more task assignment, much more back and forth than we were ever doing before, in a completely distributed fashion. All right, what about the smartphone question? Why do we look at our phones 150 to 200 times a day? Here's what's interesting about this. It's not intrinsic to the phone. This is where we get a different story than we had with email. If we go back, and I did for this Times op-ed, I went back and watched the original keynote address, 2007, Moscone Center, Steve Jobs introducing the iPhone, and then I went and talked to Andy Grigone, who was one of the lead developers on the iPhone team. If you go back to 2007 and say what was on their mind when they released the iPhone, the idea that we were supposed to check it 150 times a day was nowhere to be found. What did Steve Jobs think about the iPhone? He said, there's 2 things people like to do. They like to listen to music, they have for a long time. They like to make phone calls, they have for a long time. But the technology for doing these things is no good. And he thought it was an affront to elegance and aesthetics that we had 2 different devices in our pocket, an iPod and a Motorola. It's like we should combine these. And he really didn't like the interfaces of smartphones. He said, this is crazy that I have to dial in, type in a code to get my voicemail, and the menus are bad. To him, it was just an affront. He's like, I want to take these things we already do, I want to make them a more elegant, beautiful, sort of Steve Jobsian, typical obsessive experience, right? Didn't think about us checking it all the time. This is a quote from the keynote. It's the best iPod we've ever made. Later, he says the killer app is making phone calls. There weren't a lot of other apps to compete with this because there was no app store, because Steve Jobs didn't want other people to be able to write stuff for his elegant experience. There was no app store when it was launched. It takes 30 minutes in that keynote for him to get to talking about the internet. The first 30 minutes is talking about the iPod features, then talking about the phone features. That's what he cared about. I asked Andy about this, and he confirmed. He said, yeah, Jobs saw it as an iPod that made phone calls. It was beautiful. Like, that's what he cared about. So it wasn't intrinsic. Unlike with email, which changed things almost immediately once we got it. The iPhone is not intrinsically something we were supposed to look at all the time. So what happened? There's a crude story we could tell here that's missing out some details, but I think gets to the core of it. And it's a story that starts with the like button. It starts with the Facebook engineering team and the like button. And what you see if you look into the story of how this got introduced is that it was originally driven by engineers, and it was introduced for a relatively techno, boring, geeky optimization type of reason. The engineers simply said, I'm looking at Facebook posts, and our issue with this is if you're posting something that is nice, a lot of people say nice with an exclamation point or something like this. These are my tribe, right? I'm a computer scientist. They say this is unoptimal because somewhere in these comments are some real ones, right? So it's like nice, 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 and this person says, wait, that mushroom's poison, don't eat it, right? We want that to be more prominent. And so the engineers had this fixed. They say, well, we'll have a like button. So if all you're doing is giving a general affirmation of positivity, which is probably the terms they use if I know them, just click this button. And then you go, yeah, I like it, good, nice, right? And then you could see that, and then the comments would be left for the more substantive things. So it's just an engineering idea. But they released this thing. It goes on the mobile app, because this is the mobile era, right? We're shifting to mobile at this period, and they get this side effect. Everyone's looking at Facebook much more. They realize, oh, what's going on here is this is not just a way to optimize comments, but we accidentally introduced into this new thing that people bring with them everywhere, a social approval indicator. And people turn out to really care a lot about social approval indicators. Information about what other people think about us is incredibly powerful. I mean, for most people in this room, if I put 2 envelopes in front of you, $100, something I just heard someone saying about you, you get 1. At least half the people in the room are taking the gossip envelope, right? That we're wired for this, right? There's obviously an obvious argument in a very social being species that we care about this. So they accidentally introduced the social approval indicator. And then there was another element that was accidental about it. Its arrival was intermittent. Sometimes when I turn on this app, I get a bunch of social approval. Sometimes I don't, and I don't know what the pattern is. So that was really appealing, right? I mean, where have we seen before, here's something you really like that I'm going to sometimes give to you and sometimes not? I mean, that's a slot machine. They didn't realize this is what they were doing, but they immediately saw the effect. Oh my God, once these apps are with people wherever they go, we can actually engineer this to get more and more of their attention. And once that idea was out, the industry ran with it. Really big industries. Meta's a $900 billion market cap company. They're spending a lot of money on this because it goes directly to their bottom line. So it began what Tristan Harris later called the race to the bottom of the brainstem. How do we engineer these things so you spend more and more time? It's with you. So spend more and more time looking at it and looking at our things. And so we start with the like button, which now seems almost innocent. And we end in the age of TikTok, where we have now essentially discarded anything but attention engineering. And TikTok will just say, this is an intention-engineered app. Its whole purpose is to make you look at it. They don't even bother, like Facebook tried to say it's about social connection. They don't bother, like Twitter did, to say this is about trying to keep up with the news, or Instagram to say to keep up with artists. They just said, you know, pretty picture look, you're not going to be able to look away. Like, they were just bald about it. And it works really well. It turns out if you just purify attention engineering, you can get really, really good at it. And TikTok's really, really good at it. And it can be incredibly difficult to look away. So again, we have a story here of a device that we were introducing for purpose A, and then ended up having this massive impact because of side effect B that no one at the time was thinking about. So what does this teach us? Well, I want to give a brief set of implications about this particular storyline, prefaced with the idea that this does not, of course, explain all technologies and all technological adoptions. And of course, this doesn't explain all of the factors between these particular technologies and their adoptions. But what can we learn from this thread of how we sometimes end up with technologies having these big negative impacts? And I want to give you a brief idea that I introduced a few years ago in an article for the Communications of the ACM. It's a trade publication for computer scientists and engineers. So I was using engineering speak because I was talking to engineers. And my claim was, in stories like email, in stories like the smartphone, what we're really dealing with, because again, I have to use engineering speak in Engineering Magazine, is a complex dynamical system. That what we have here is some sort of existing techno-economic social system that is complex and dynamical. That's a technical engineering term that means small perturbations in the inputs to this machine can lead to large, unpredictable changes in the outputs. This is the picture of a state space from a complex dynamical system, and it's trying to show you that a little change in the input can change the state space from being way over there to being way over there. It's a drastically different configuration, and they're hard to predict what's going to happen. Famous original example of these systems is Lorenz from MIT, and talking about the butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil, and you end up 3 days later with a typhoon in Japan. They're talking about weather as a complex dynamical system. My contention is we often see, when we look at these type of technologies entering our lives, a complex dynamical system at play. Email comes into the complex system of the autonomy-rich, completely distributed, Peter Drucker-inspired knowledge work headquarters of IBM, and it drastically changes how they work in unpredictable ways. We introduce a phone because it's iPods and a Motorola. It's inelegant to have them as separate devices, and within a few years, we have a sort of obsessive use that's causing wide-scale negative social-emotional issues. The system radically reconfigured in ways we didn't predict. Once we understand this can sometimes happen, this gives us implications for how do we think about other technologies. Not just these, but other technologies that might have a similar dynamical system type impact. So I want to leave you with 3 ideas about this, the last one being sort of deliberately provocative. All right, 1, it tells us that we can't be confident that we can always stop bad technologies before they come out. I mean, I run a major that teaches computer scientists how to also know ethics, and we want them embedded in companies, but it's quixotic to assume that we can figure out in advance, wait a second, don't do that, that's going to cause trouble. Sometimes it's clear, and sometimes it's not. Nobody at the Moscone Center in 2007 said, wait a second, Steve, before you release this, what about the large uptick in hospitalizations for self-harm among adolescent girls that we're going to see in 6 years? No one was making that connection yet. Similarly, they spent a lot of money on this mini computer at IBM. They had no notion. They tried. They were literally studying how much communication is going to happen, and they were taken completely by surprise. I put this up just to give you an example about how bad we are at this. This was something I wrote in 2016. This is late, 2016, where they put "quit social media" in the title. This was such a controversy. People were so aghast as late as 2016 that I would say social media is bad, that the New York Times the next week commissioned a response op-ed. Don't quit social media. And it's the first paragraph. Cal Newport is wrong. Social media is very important. As late as 2016. By the way, this, if you see the date here, this was several days after the presidential election. So it's not like they didn't have other news to report. But my point is that's really late for us still. Our standard line was like, this is all great. Cal is dangerous to say it's wrong. By 2017, of course, we finally began to realize, I don't know, okay, maybe like Facebook is not all good. So we're bad at this. It's hard to fix dynamical systems. This is a core part of their definition. Their inner workings are complicated. That's why we call it complex. So to come in and tinker with the inner workings of a complex dynamical system and feel like we can control and change it. Oh, we'll just tweak this, this, and this, and then the hurricane will stop over in Japan. That turns out to be really hard to do. We see this when we try to tinker then with these techno-dynamical systems. We're trying to do this right now with smartphones and kids and the negative mental health impact we were talking about. Richard Blumenthal and Marsha Blackburn proposed this law, KOSA, right, the Kids Online Safety Act. This passed out of committee in August. It's a very complex bill that was essentially trying to fix the internet so it wouldn't be bad for kids. That turns out to be really hard to do. And everyone's turning on it because there's complexity and side effects. Well, if you do this, what about this? You do this, you can't just say don't do that because you'll turn off this content. What about these people? And it's falling apart. It's difficult to go in with these systems and just tweak things around to try to get them back to where they were. We see the same thing with email. We've tried to have better corporate norms about response times and telling people to batch their email. Let's just fix the system once email is here. It doesn't work. It doesn't bring us back. It's hard to steer these systems with small fixes. So this leaves us with the final implication, which again is a bit of a provocation, but it's a thought experiment to leave. In some cases, therefore, the right thing to do is effectively remove that stimulus from the system, that new input, and say, okay, let's try again. To have a bit more of a cultural tentativeness with some of these new technological innovations. I can't tell you in advance for sure if this is going to be good or bad for us, but we're going to be careful. And if we don't like what we're seeing, we might feel good about saying, let's pull that back. And this might not be a regulatory response. This could be a cultural response. But it's something to think about that the dynamical system approach leads us to. So for example, one of the cultural responses that's emerging now to the negative harm of excessive smartphone use on young people is one of the cultural responses that's emerging right now. This is the Surgeon General is leading this charge, is to say, okay, instead of trying to fix how the internet operates so it's better for kids, what if we changed our culture about when it's appropriate to just use the internet and say maybe just kids shouldn't? that is effectively, from a dynamical system point of view, saying, whoop, let's take that input back out again. Okay. Let's be a little bit more careful about how we add this back. And maybe we should say unrestricted internet use is something that comes a little bit later. Problems with that. But it's interesting to think about because it's congruent with this model we're using. Same thing with email. This was my book, A World Without Email, is effectively arguing you cannot fix this issue about checking inboxes once every 6 minutes with a bunch of tips. We have to effectively remove email, build from scratch a different explicit way for how we collaborate in our companies that works much better, and then and only then can we carefully add back email and be like, okay, great, we don't want to use the fax machine. We all agree? Okay, we can have email back, but now it's entering a system where we've hardened it against landing in a hyperactive hive mind of constant communication. Now, I call this a provocation because this has its own problems too. These more drastic responses can also have some other drastic side effects as well. But I want to put it up there because it highlights an approach to technology in which we try to understand the dynamics going on and just see where that leads us. It's going to lead to more, hopefully, big ideas in how we deal with some of these issues of our current age. That this idea that maybe for some technologies, this more tentative approach is not necessarily the worst thing. That we come at some of these technologies saying, I'm going to keep an eye on this. And we might back off and say, you know what? We don't want to use this here. We don't think kids should use this. Let's take this back out of our office and put in another type of communication. That's nice what you built, OpenAI, but I don't think we want this in the writer's room. It's an interesting approach that I think is beginning to emerge more in a way that it was not really considered even a half decade or more earlier. Using this engineering idea of a dynamical system, I think we get a little bit of a conceptual framework of what explains this approach and why it's something that might, in some cases, be considered. All right, so I've talked to you a lot. I've thrown some ideas at you. I want to hear what other people think. So with this, I think I will summarize them. Thank you, and jump forward and ask for your questions. Yeah. Microphone. And because we're recording, we ask you to line up at the microphones, then I'll point to people back and forth. All right. There's a microphone here too as well if people see it. Okay. All right, let's go over here first.
Hi, Cal. My name's Griffin. I'm a sophomore undergrad studying public policy. And I wrote my question so I didn't forget because I'm distracted. But my question is, how have you seen addiction to technology affect people's spiritual lives? And do you think a lack of self-reflection and spiritual identity is a side effect?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There was a lot of surprising overlaps between some of this work in the world of religion that I wasn't expecting before. So for example, my book, Deep Work, is very popular among pastors who draw a direct connection between deep work, especially in preparation of sermons and contemplation, that they think is critical to what they do, actually ministering to their actual congregations. And so there's this whole, for example, school of thought that's trying to connect the contemplative tradition, which has been around a long time, to the attack on that from distraction. So I'm obviously not at the forefront of this thinking, but they send me what they're working on. There's been a lot of thought from Jewish leaders as well. There's a lot built into the Jewish tradition about grappling with Torah, for example, as an activity that requires all-out focus. So I think there's really cool intersections between these worlds. But if we flip it around to your question, so how does that affect the average person's spiritual life if they're spiritual? Then we can expect the inverse to happen. So if religious leaders are realizing we have to really prioritize unbroken contemplation, then if that's not happening in the life of one of their congregates or one of the adherents, then we can assume there's probably going to be a negative impact. So much of spirituality has in it this big element of self-reflective contemplation, trying to detect intimations from within of moral guidance and divine. So I think there's huge things to uncover here behind how distraction actually can get in the way of the core mechanisms of the religious life as we know it. Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. Yeah, other microphone.
Hi, is this working? Okay. Hi, my name is Sinu. Thank you very much for the talk. Very interesting. So I'm one of the black sheep that does not have social media. I've never had it.
We're the two.
Hey. Never had it. And it's been really interesting to engage in this conversation from that perspective. I guess my question is about, it seems as if, at least among college students, social media is really woven into the fabric of social life. And so when it comes to the question of like removing the input in order to like get back to the older outcome, is it possible that it's like once you go forward you can't go back, or like or have you seen other examples of ways people have dealt with?
Great question.
Yeah.
Well, we were talking about that in the reception before we came in as well. So what seems to be important here is that what you're saying is a key point. I mean, this is also an issue with schools, high school age students as well, that if sociality is built into these apps, John Haidt writes about this, to be a single person that just removes from that system, you can actually end up worse. Like, okay, I wasn't liking this, but I hate this even more. So what seems to be important is robust alternative being in place. And so at the high school level, there's not a lot of work, but there's some of us who've been talking to schools who really are pushing this. You have to build a culture of this is how it works to be social at this age if you don't have this particular tools. At the college level, this is something you would do sort of more on your own. You would say, okay, if I'm going to step away from these tools, I better have in place first how my social life works. Who's important to me? How do I spend time to them? What things am I a part of? How am I going to make sure that I have the regular infusion of sociality? I can go to things, I know what's going on. And you have to sort of tailor that to your own position on the extroversion, introversion scale. Some people care more about events. Some people care more about deep conversations on a semi-regular basis. But you have to have something in place, or soon after you remove the stimulus, or you could end up exactly in a worse situation. So I think it's a really good point. If we're going to use our metaphor, if the system has changed, when you remove just yourself using social media, you're not removing it from everybody. So you're changing where you are in an already changed system. So you have to do a little bit more work for sure. Yeah, very good question. Yeah, other microphone.
Hi, my name is Mindy Miller. I'm a staff member at Duke. I have a similar question, but with a little bit different thought or lens. I mean, I think of it sort of, isn't this like Pandora's box? Isn't it out already? And I hear what you're saying, but from a policy perspective, a regulatory perspective, what are your thoughts on, I mean, that just seems impossible to me to implement something that would put this back in the box.
Yeah, you can't go back in the box because you can't actually, you're not removing the input altogether. You're partially removing it and getting a better configuration, but it's never the same. I agree with that. From a regulatory perspective, it's complicated, right? There's no silver bullets here, and I don't know anyone who thinks they have a silver bullet. There's different schools of thought about regulatory changes versus cultural changes. One of the things I happen to be really interested in right now is when we think in particular about the attention economy, is trying to move away from the model of a small number of monopoly platforms through which all interaction occurs and getting to a more sort of heterogeneous, diverse set of many different types of channels and apps and communities through which people communicate. That was the original web version. Vision, I should say. That was the original vision of the internet and the web, is that it's a common protocol so anyone can talk to anyone else. And as I argued in a New Yorker piece last month, the vision was not, okay, if anyone can talk to anyone else, we should all talk to each other. It was you can find people to talk to that you never would have before. You can find people who share a particular interest or a particular experience. You can come together and find each other on the internet in a way you couldn't before. But we perverted that and said, no, we want everyone to be on the same channel. We need everyone to be on the same global Twitter-style conversation platform. And that just doesn't work because that's way too much communication. So we have to incredibly heavily curate it, and then the curation pushes it towards extremes, and all these issues come out of it. So this one regulatory lever I'm interested in, and this could be about breaking up large monopolies. This could be about changing other relevant regulations that makes it less financially feasible to be a giant. There's something interesting in that, because I think an internet that's more diverse in terms of where you go for a lot of different reasons is one that actually eliminates a lot of, not all, but a lot of the issues we're seeing today, or at least makes them better. We could sort of step a little bit back towards the old internet, which, by the way, I don't think it's a step back so much as what we did in the last 10 years, building 3 or 4 private internets that everyone uses, owned by 3 companies. That, I think, was the divergence. I think that was I don't blame people for trying to do that. They made a lot of money for those initial investors, but that's the perversion of the internet spirit. So it's almost not closing Pandora's box. I see that more like we fell off of this techno path into this weird swamp, and like let's crawl back out onto the main path again. There's still some promise there. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Hi there, I'm Ian Hitchcock, a second-year Master's of Public Policy student. Loved chatting with you at lunch.
Yeah, I remember you from earlier.
One of the things that I was thinking about after that conversation that I didn't hear you bring up tonight were kind of the economic incentives that are driving companies to be seeking attention and clicks at all else. Essentially, the commodification of human attention strikes me as one of the bigger obstacles to try to change devices being created to be addictive. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on different financial models for tech companies so they're no longer using kind of our eyeballs and our clicks as a proxy for goodness and money.
Well, this is one of the reasons why moving to an internet that it's away from having a small number of these monopoly platforms is that when you go back to an older internet model where there's lots of different communities for lots of different purposes, now you can have economic diversity as well, and now you get things like subscription fee models, right? Where so if I'm spending a few dollars a month for this community, then you have no incentive to try to keep me addictively using it. Your incentive is to make the use in my life high. Like, oh, I get good stuff out of this. This makes my life better. So you get models like that. The smaller communities also have other types of financial models. I mean, I profiled one in that New Yorker piece. It was a baseball discussion group. You can have like one thing you sell to your audience of 500 that they like, and it is a financially viable living, but you're not trying to monopolize attention. So in general, I think we get a lot more economic innovation when we move from the model of you have to be a $500 billion company. That's what we demand. We're trying to grow you to be the biggest possible thing. When you stop trying to do that, you get a lot more diversity, and you see a lot of that happening. I wrote another piece about revisiting the 1,000 True Fans model of Kevin Kelly and saying there's actually a lot of tools out there right now that allow for small communities built around maybe like a small number of thinkers or creatives or artists or people who share a similar interest. They have lots of ways to monetize it that's not advertising or attention-based. So I think the internet is ready and already doing that. The issue, I think, again, is the small number of really large monopoly platforms that until recently everyone felt compelled to use. Fortunately, I think that's changing. Yeah.
Hey, my name is Theo DeSauer. I'm currently at high school. But you mentioned a study by the American College Health Association that was like saying the increase in the diagnosis of mental health disorders, things like that. Some of those were like schizophrenia, bipolar, and even depression at some level. They're mainly genetic. Do you think the internet is allowing us to detect these more, or also could be bringing like the smaller parts that like are usually, say somebody has a mild case of schizophrenia? Do you think it's like enhancing those side effects that
Yeah.
we've seen?
No, it's a really good question. And again, there's a whole talk to give just on this data, which I did last week actually. So don't tempt me, I'll bring them out. A couple of really quick things going on here. The main thing to increase was actually anxiety and depression, but depression goes with anxiety because these are tightly intertwined. The other standard things we see at non-trivial levels at that age group didn't change as much. So really the correlation, there's a correlation with anxiety. This is what people seem to be seeing at college health, mental health clinics, for example. So more anecdotally report, anxiety took off in 2012, right? So there's more of a connection specifically to that. And then there is a question of, but what about, and I get into this whole thing in the talk, how much of this is just we're more comfortable self-reporting? Unfortunately, we have standard ways of looking at that. We ground truth anxiety diagnoses by looking at hospitalizations, non-fatal self-harm. We also ground truth it, unfortunately, looking at suicide. And we see, again, it's tragic, but we see the curves follow exactly with the ground truth metrics we really use. So it's not a self-reporting issue. Anxiety is much higher, and it's really started in 2012.
Can I say one more quick?
Yeah, please.
Do you think that it could also be a product of like parents and like family things? Like you see, like I know some of my friends, they have like their parents are super into tech. Do you think it's not just looking at the phone, but also the environment that the internet has created around us for the entire world?
Yeah, you know, it could be both, right? So it could be a little bit chicken and egg. So maybe there's something with the way we isolate this a little better. So when I was talking about independent strands, that's definitely playing effect. But we have a couple different ways of trying to isolate just the phone use. So the easiest way is correlational studies, where you say, just let's look at the regression analysis between smartphone use and social media use and this particular anxiety. And we see if you use the phone more, you live in the same world, if you use the phone more, it goes up. Then we have randomized control trials that does this, where we can go the other way. You stop using social media this week, you keep using it. Oh wait, your anxiety metrics go down. And then we have these really cool natural experiments. There's this really nice one an economist, doctoral student did in Canada, where high-speed wireless internet came to this town before it came to that town. They're in the same world, they're a couple miles apart. The town that got it first, you saw this notable increase in anxiety diagnoses, especially among adolescent girls, that wasn't in this town. And the only thing separating them. So we have these different independent things that say there's a lot of factors, but the looking at this all the time is clearly a strong one. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Great questions. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Will Monahan. I'm a senior studying political science and computer science. I wanted to ask, I think I'm not the only one who sometimes wishes the days of misses the days of flip phones. And so I was wondering, do you think there's a hardware angle to this where we might start to see more companies come in and offer intentionally simplified products or intentionally?
Yeah, there's a market for it. Yeah, people are doing it. I mean, I know these guys that have this company called Lightphone, where it's essentially, it's a sleek phone. It looks like an iPhone, but you can only text to make calls on it. Also, yeah, flip phones are just having a comeback. I did a little reporting for a while. There's a very particular flip phone that is really popular among hedge fund managers, who are, because there's so many dollars at stake, they're really obsessive about, which makes sense, like concentration and focus, because if they get distracted, this could be like a $20 million blip. And so they have this weird subculture of this very particular flip phone that they all use. It somehow just got a life of its own. So yes, we're seeing that. Even Apple adding screen time to iPhone was part of this. What I think was going on here is, we talked about this earlier, but they were thumbing their nose at Android, because Google is an attention economy company, and the whole point of Android is to support the attention economy, different companies in that economy. So they couldn't add restrictions to their phone that means you use it less. Apple is not an attention economy company. They're a hardware company. They don't care if you use the iPhone 100 times or one time. They just want you to buy the iPhone. So they added features like, look, you can turn off our phone easier, because they said our competitors can't do that. Their whole model is this makes it easy for you to like write apps on here, we can keep track of things. So yeah, I think this is definitely a big move, is as people get more skeptical or more worried about this landscape, this techno-distraction landscape, as people get more worried, I think that market's growing. Yeah.
Thank you.
What do your comments imply? I'm sorry, Geraldine Ritter, I'm on the Board of Visitors here. What does I'm just thinking about the trend toward remote work with COVID, and now, it's in all the headlines that employees don't want to go back to the office and bosses want them back in the office. Yeah. Obviously at home you're much more dependent on your technology to engage with colleagues. Where do you think that debate is headed?
So I reported on this for a while. Like in the heart of the pandemic, I was doing a twice a month column for the New Yorker just about work and these issues, how it was shifting in the pandemic. And I came away with a couple conclusions. So one conclusion I came away with is, if you just take work the way we were doing it in the office and say, just do it like this, but do it at home, here's a Zoom account, there's a lot of inefficiencies that come with that. We get things like overhead explosion, where I'm in Zoom 8 hours in a row. We get this frustration of I'm working more than even before, and yet less is getting done. And there's a whole sort of analysis about why that happens. And I think that's partially why managers are like, let's just come back to the office. However, what's also happening during the pandemic is there was innovation occurring. So my argument was, remote work, for it to work, requires that you accompany it with a whole new system for thinking about how do we work. You can't just take in-person work and do it at home. And so remote work to be sustainable in the future requires major changes to how we identify tasks, assign tasks, talk to each other, collaborate, how we actually organize our work ourselves. That has to be more structured for remote work to work. And so my thought is, it's an argument I made in a column last year, is native startups, remote native startups during the pandemic. So startups that started during the pandemic, so they were remote from the beginning, are innovating how to make this work. And so out there in the world now, it's like the virus that hasn't really left the initial place yet, there are these ideas about how this would work better. And I was quoting another entrepreneur here, this is not all my idea, but if you believe this theory, what you're going to see then is remote work went all the way up because of COVID. Now it's coming back down because it doesn't necessarily work that well just to say, do what you're doing at the office at home. As these ideas spread and mature and spread to bigger companies, I think it's going to be a U. Remote work is going to come back up. We're probably going to hit the nadir in the next year or so, I would assume, somewhere at like 40%, depending on how you monitor it and how you measure it. I think it's going to come back up some as these more sustainable ways of doing remote work spread. So I think that the pandemic probably seeded innovation that we just don't see yet. That's the optimistic take on what's going on. Yep. All right. Yeah.
Hey, Cal, my name's Ethan. Really enjoyed the talk. I'm gonna try to just. My question was a little bit more on the personal level. So I really appreciated the overview of sort of, you know, trends and data that we see. Really helpful. From a individual perspective, I guess, sometimes it feels a little disheartening that we're going up against trillion-dollar companies that are commodifying our attention. So I guess, you know, I've experimented with a little bit of like meditation, which has really helped, but like, what are some words of encouragement for people, you know, trying, because I feel like if you ask anyone in this room, they're probably like, I'm not happy with how much I use my phone, right? So like, how do you have some agency?
Yes.
As an individual against these companies?
Yeah, in one of my books, I called it joining the attention resistance, like almost thinking about it like a resistance mindset. Here, the encouraging words is, it's true, these are huge companies that are spending a ton of money. They're really invested in making their applications very sticky, but they also don't really care if you as an individual are using their application or not. No one from TikTok is going to show up at your door if you stop using it, right? No one from Instagram is going to get mad if they say, why aren't you using Instagram anymore? So you actually have a huge amount of agency. You could walk away right now and nothing's going to happen other than you might miss it a little bit. So I think that's really encouraging. And so what I would add to that, you know, this was an idea for my book, Digital Minimalism. The right thing to do is to start really aggressively investing in what's the thing you want to do instead. So you start investing in these other parts of your life, like getting involved in things and causes and starting things and joining things and building up new skills and these things that you really, really love to do. Build that up and then turn your attention over to the apps again and maybe say like, TikTok no, Instagram no. And it's not even going to be that hard to walk away because you have something else to do now. And so anyways, you have the agency. They really want lots of people to use it, but they don't care if you're using it. So I think you're better off than you think you might be.
All right, thank you.
All right. Well, I think that's the time. So, but thank you again, everybody.
Thank you so much, Cal. I think that we're all going to leave here determined to try, to make a change in our lives. Before I send you off, I want to remind you all that we have another lecture coming up on the 3rd of November. This is going to be with Jasmine Crowe. She's a Durham native and a founder of a company or an NGO really called Gooder, which is a company that or an organization that's designed to reduce food waste and feed communities. And this woman is dynamite. You don't want to miss her. It's going to be a great conversation about entrepreneurship, about doing good, and about leading. And so I invite you to put that on your calendar for the 3rd of November. And if you're interested in learning more about the Sanford School, you can go to our website and see some of the many other things we have going on. But otherwise, you're going to get a little email? Sorry. Survey to let you know what you liked about it. Maybe we shouldn't send an email. I don't know. Did you like this? Just raise your hands if you liked it. Yay! They liked it. Okay, we don't need to do the email. Scratch that. Anyhow, please join me in thanking Cal one more time.